Hardcore punk was never supposed to win awards. It was never designed for mainstream stages, polished interviews, or industry validation. Hardcore lived in the shadows, in cramped rooms, underground venues, and scenes built on sweat, chaos, and community. It was loud, it was raw, and it didn't ask for permission. For decades, hardcore punk rejected the idea of success, because success often meant compromise. And yet, somewhere along the way, everything changed. In a music industry obsessed with algorithms, trends, and commercial appeal, a band rooted in hardcore punk broke through the noise, not by playing the game, but by refusing to stay still. That band was Turnstile, a group that came from the underground and ended up standing on one of the biggest stages in music history, earning Grammy nominations while still carrying the DNA of hardcore punk. To some, Turnstile represents the future. To others, they represent everything hardcore was never meant to become. So the question isn't just who Turnstile is. The real question is, did Turnstile sell out, or did they prove that hardcore punk was always meant to evolve? This is the story of how a hardcore band from Baltimore didn't just change their sound, they changed the conversation. To understand where Turnstile came from, you have to step back, before the streams, the headlines, and the awards, to the world of hardcore punk itself. Hardcore punk emerged in the late 1970s and early 1980s as a reaction to both mainstream rock and the growing commercialization of punk. Bands played faster, songs became shorter, and the message was clear: no polish, no gatekeepers, no compromise. Hardcore wasn't designed for radio. It lived in basements, community halls, and DIY spaces, built by scenes that valued presence over popularity. And by the time Turnstile formed decades later, those values were still deeply embedded in the culture. Turnstile came out of Baltimore, Maryland, a city with a long history of underground music, but far removed from the traditional music industry spotlight. Baltimore's hardcore scene wasn't about chasing trends. It was about showing up. You earned your place by playing shows, supporting other bands, and contributing to something bigger than yourself. Turnstile did exactly that. In their early years, their sound sat firmly within hardcore tradition. Fast tempos, heavy riffs, and physical high-energy performances. Releases like Pressure to Succeed placed them clearly inside the scene. They weren't redefining hardcore, they were participating in it. And that distinction matters, because when Turnstile later began to evolve, it wasn't from a place of distance or ignorance. It came from inside the culture, but even then, subtle differences were already present. Their music carried a sense of rhythm that stood out. There was movement in the songs, not just aggression, a feeling that leaned as much toward release as it did toward confrontation. In a genre often defined by tension, Turnstile introduced moments of openness. Nothing about this phase suggested Grammy stages or global recognition, but it planted the foundation for something unusual. Because Turnstile didn't see hardcore as a cage, they saw it as a starting point. Hardcore punk has always been defined by limits. Limits in sound, limits in structure, limits in how far a band is allowed to go before the scene pushes back. For a long time, Turnstile stayed comfortably within those boundaries, but slowly, almost quietly, they began to stretch them. As the band grew more confident, their music started to breathe. The aggression was still there, the speed was still there, but something else was emerging beneath the surface. Groove. Not groove in the traditional sense of funk or dance music, but a rhythmic looseness that felt unfamiliar in hardcore. Where many bands emphasized tension and confrontation, Turnstile emphasized movement. This shift became impossible to ignore with the release of Time and Space in 2018. On the surface, Time and Space was still a hardcore record. Fast songs, heavy guitars, mosh-ready energy. But listen closer, and the cracks in the formula start to show. Bass lines that bounced instead of punishing. Riffs that lingered longer than expected. Moments that felt melodic, even uplifting, without losing intensity. For some fans, this was exciting. For others, it was unsettling. Because hardcore traditionally doesn't invite you to feel good. It challenges you. It confronts you. Sometimes it overwhelms you. Time and Space did something different. It invited people in. Turnstile wasn't abandoning hardcore's aggression. They were reframing it. The songs still hit hard, but they also felt open, less claustrophobic, more human, and that openness changed the audience. Suddenly, Turnstile shows weren't just filled with longtime hardcore kids. They attracted listeners from outside the scene, people drawn to the energy, even if they didn't know the rules. This is where the tension began, because in hardcore culture, growth is complicated. More listeners can mean more visibility, but visibility has often been treated as a threat. And while time and space didn't spark outrage, it raised questions, quiet ones at first. Is this still hardcore? How far can this go? And what happens if it goes further? Turnstile didn't answer those questions publicly. They answered them musically. And with every step forward, they made one thing clear. They weren't interested in standing still. When Turnstile stepped into the light, by the end of Time and Space, one thing was clear. Turnstile was no longer just a hardcore band playing within the scene. They were becoming something harder to define. But what came next wasn't a gradual step forward. It was a leap. In 2021, Turnstile released Glow On, an album that didn't just expand their sound, but completely reframed how people talked about them. From the very first moments of the record, Glow On felt different. Not heavier, not faster, but wider. The songs weren't confined to hardcore's usual tension. They breathed, they shimmered, they moved in unexpected directions. There were traces of hardcore everywhere: the urgency, the physicality, the raw energy. But now they existed alongside textures pulled from outside the genre: shoegaze, alternative rock, dream pop, even hints of funk and ambient music. What made Glow On remarkable wasn't just the range of influences. It was how confidently they were blended. Nothing felt ironic. Nothing felt calculated. The album didn't sound like a band trying to cross over. It sounded like a band unlocking something they had been holding back. Songs like Blackout and Holiday carried the pulse of hardcore while opening themselves to melody and space. Mystery stripped the aggression even further, leaning into vulnerability without losing momentum. And somehow, it all made sense. For longtime fans, Glow On was confusing. For new listeners, it was inviting. Turnstile didn't ask you to understand hardcore history. They asked you to feel the music. And people did. Suddenly, Turnstile wasn't just appearing in hardcore conversations. They were showing up on festival lineups, in mainstream music publications, and on playlists far removed from punk's underground. The audience changed. The rooms got bigger. The reach expanded. But the energy, the sweat, the movement, the communal release remained. That balance is what made Glow On so powerful. It wasn't hardcore diluted, it was hardcore transformed. And with that transformation came a shift in identity. Turnstile stopped being a band defined by where they came from and became a band defined by where they were going. But evolution, especially in a culture built on resistance, never comes without consequences. As Glow On continued to reach new audiences, the conversation around Turnstile began to shift. What started as curiosity slowly turned into scrutiny. In hardcore culture, success has always been complicated. The scene was built as a response to mainstream music, to the idea that art should be marketable, clean, and easily consumed. So when a band rooted in hardcore begins to grow beyond the underground, the first question is rarely about the music. It's about intention. Were they still part of the culture, or were they leaving it behind? For Turnstile, the backlash didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through comment sections, forum discussions, and quiet conversations between longtime fans. Some argued that the band had softened their sound, that the aggression was gone, that Glow On didn't feel hardcore anymore. Others questioned the visuals, the presentation, the way Turnstile was now framed by the media. But beneath all of it was a familiar accusation. They sold out. It's a label that has followed punk and hardcore bands for decades, often used less as a critique of sound and more as a reaction to visibility. But Turnstile's case was different. They didn't change overnight. They didn't chase radio hits, and they didn't abandon the physical intensity of their live shows. If anything, their performances became more communal. Less about confrontation and more about shared release. The anger that once fueled hardcore wasn't erased. It was redirected, and that redirection challenged long-held assumptions. Because if hardcore was truly about honesty, then shouldn't growth be allowed? The backlash revealed a deeper tension, not just around Turnstile, but around hardcore itself. Was hardcore a fixed sound, frozen in time, or was it a mindset, one that could evolve without losing its core? Turnstile never answered these questions directly. They didn't defend themselves in interviews, they didn't explain the changes, they kept playing. And in doing so, they forced the scene, and the wider music world, to confront an uncomfortable idea. Maybe success doesn't automatically mean compromise. Maybe evolution doesn't have to be betrayal. By the time Turnstile moved into the mid-2020s, their evolution was no longer something to debate. It had become a clear direction. In 2025, they released Never Enough, an album that didn't try to recreate the impact of Glow On, but instead clarified who Turnstile had grown into. Where Glow On felt like an explosion of possibility, Never Enough felt intentional, measured, more controlled. The physical intensity of hardcore was still present, but it was handled with greater patience. Textures were allowed to linger. Grooves sat deeper in the mix. Melodies weren't rushed. They were given space to breathe. Rather than sounding like a band moving away from hardcore, Never Enough sounded like a band that had fully absorbed it and was now speaking through it in a broader language. That balance is especially clear on tracks like Birds. The song carried weight and aggression, but it wasn't confined to hardcore's traditional urgency. It felt expansive, almost cinematic, heavy, not because it was fast or chaotic, but because it was emotionally dense. This wasn't music designed to chase accessibility. It was music that trusted its audience, and in doing so, it reached further than Turnstile ever had before. So when the 2026 Grammy Awards arrived, the recognition didn't feel sudden. It felt delayed. Turnstile received multiple nominations, crossing into categories that hardcore punk had historically existed outside of. By the end of the night, Never Enough was awarded Best Rock Album, while Birds received Best Metal Performance. For most hardcore bands, this kind of recognition would have been unthinkable. Hardcore was never meant to be framed as excellence within institutional standards. It was built to resist them. But for Turnstile, the moment didn't feel out of place, because their evolution had never been about escape. It had always been about expansion. They didn't reshape themselves to fit the Grammys. Instead, the Grammys, briefly, had to expand their definition to make room for them. And that distinction matters. This wasn't a hardcore band winning awards by abandoning its roots. It was a band carrying hardcore's spirit into spaces it had never been allowed to enter. In that sense, the Grammy moment wasn't a contradiction. It was documentation, proof that a culture born in basements and small rooms could grow without losing its center and still be recognized on the world's biggest stages. By the end of this story, it becomes clear that Turnstile's journey was never just about success. It was about possibility. The debates around their evolution, the accusations, the praise, the discomfort, all point to something deeper than one band's career. They point to a long-standing tension within hardcore itself. Hardcore was born as a response, a rejection of mainstream culture, a space where intensity mattered more than approval. But rejection, over time, can harden into limitation. And Turnstile challenged that. Not with statements or manifestos, but with music. They didn't erase hardcore's identity. They reframed it. They showed that aggression doesn't have to be narrow. That intensity can coexist with openness. That community doesn't disappear when the room gets bigger. Turnstile didn't make hardcore safer. They made it wider. And in doing so, they exposed a truth that had always existed beneath the surface. Hardcore was never meant to stay frozen in time. It was meant to respond to the present. For some, Turnstile will always feel like a departure. For others, they represent a future that feels long overdue. But maybe both reactions are valid, because evolution always creates distance between generations, between expectations, between what was and what comes next. What Turnstile ultimately proved wasn't that hardcore needed to change. They proved that it could. And that realization extends beyond music. It speaks to growth without erasure, to honoring origins without being trapped by them, to the idea that authenticity isn't about repetition, it's about honesty. Turnstile didn't answer every question about hardcore's future, but they made one thing impossible to ignore. The underground doesn't lose its power when it's seen. Sometimes it finally gets the space to become everything it was capable of being. So maybe the real legacy of Turnstile isn't the albums or the awards or the debates they sparked. It's the permission they gave to imagine hardcore not as a closed chapter, but as an open horizon.